Probably one of the most common questions that I get is how do I find the books that I choose to read and talk about on this channel? Because at this point, I've built a bit of a reputation for talking about obscure books. I don't want to say the most obscure. I know there are people that are out there reading things that are even more wild and experimental, but a very common comment that I will get is, wow, you talk about books that I've never heard of before or never seen anyone else reviewing. And so today I'm going to talk about my secret weapon for finding interesting books. Now, we've done a whole podcast episode on how we find the books we choose to read, but one thing we didn't really talk about in that episode is university presses. Now, these are often thought about as like, oh, the college professor had his own textbook published through his university. And that, of course, does happen quite a bit. But there are actually a lot of universities out there publishing very interesting works of literature and fiction. So today I'm going to be talking about some of my favorite university presses as well as the books that I've read from those presses. And also down below, I'll put a list of all of the presses that I'm aware of that are publishing fiction and literature. If there are a couple that I don't mention and you know of some, please drop them down below so we can all check out their catalogs. But let's get right into some of these amazing publications and the books. The first publisher I want to talk about is one that you've probably heard me mention before if you've been following me for a while, but you might not have realized that they're actually in association with a university, and that is Open Letter Books, and they are a part of the University of Rochester, and they specialize in works in translation. I've read a ton of their books, but the two I'm going to talk about today are Winter in Sokcho by Elisa Dusapin. Not only does this have one of my favorite covers of any book, I love the bubblegum pink, and the font on it is really cool. It's just an interesting story. Elisa Dusapin is a French and Korean author. This was originally written in French, and it won the 2021 National Book Award for Translated Literature. And it also went pretty viral on Book Talk, which is cool because you don't usually see books from these smaller independent presses getting that kind of attention. And for good reason. It's a very interesting book. It's about a woman who's living in this fishing town in the northern part of South Korea, and she works at a bed and breakfast, which is obviously very influenced by seasonal work of tourism. And in the wintertime, there just isn't a whole lot of that. So the book has a very kind of sad and somber tone to it to begin with. It's a great book to read if your environment kind of matches that. So I do encourage people to read that in the wintertime. But she kind of gets romantically involved with one of the guests there. And even though I didn't fully appreciate it when I read it, it is a book that I still think about a lot, which I think is a great sign of a good book. This was her debut novel. Open Letter also publishes her two subsequent works, which I have copies of, but I've yet to read. But yeah, if you like short novels that can pack an emotional punch, this is definitely a good place to start. I've read a ton of books from Open Letter Publishing, but this next one's probably my absolute favorite. It's Natural Causes by Nina Lykke. This was originally written in Norwegian, and this is about a primary care physician who's pretty late on into her career. She's feeling very burnt out on her career. She's also been married for a long time, and she feels very burnt out in her marriage as well. And she starts to make some not so great life choices. And then she starts to have these kind of hallucinatory conversations with the plastic skeleton in her office, and the skeleton berates her about some of those life choices, the way that she talks to her colleagues and her patients, and some of the things she's choosing to do in her marriage. Even though it's a kind of sad book, it feels very human. It's also got a lot of humor in it, which I really liked. I think balancing that in a book can be extremely challenging, and this book does it just as good as any I've ever read. One thing I'll say about Open Letters, they're definitely unafraid to push the envelope with experimental works, and I think you'll find that's kind of true across the board with university presses, especially the ones that publish fiction or things related to fiction. A lot of the big five publishers and their imprints are really focused on works that are going to be commercially successful, where university presses seem to be taking a chance on things that are more experimental or are really just about the quality of the work, regardless of the commercial viability. And I think this next book kind of demonstrates that perfectly, even though technically it's not fiction, and it's also a book I've yet to read. But when I explain to you what it is, you'll understand why. So this is a Mason and Dixon companion by Brett Biebel, published by the University of Georgia. And if you're not familiar with Mason and Dixon, it is one of Thomas Pynchon's novels. Now, Thomas Pynchon obviously has written some very important works. He's been writing for a very long time now, but he's still not really like a household name, even amongst avid readers. You really have to be kind of into obscure American literature to really have Thomas Pynchon on your map. And so you're not going to see a ton of stuff like this in publication. Of course, you are going to see a lot of online guides for Thomas Pynchon's works because Thomas Pynchon is notoriously difficult to read. But Mason and Dixon, even though it's like highly rated by Thomas Pynchon fans, I wouldn't say it's like really that popular compared to some of his other works. A lot of the reading guides you're going to see out there are for works like Gravity's Rainbow, obviously, or The Crying of Lot 49. So the fact that there is a publication willing to publish a guide about a relatively obscure novel, I think is pretty cool. So if you plan on reading or rereading Mason and Dixon anytime soon, definitely check out a Mason and Dixon companion. I'll put a link to it below. Now, this next publisher is the publisher that really turned me on to university presses. I was already reading a lot of books from Open Letter, but I thought at that time that Open Letter was kind of like a one-off situation. I still didn't really fully appreciate the fact that there are a lot of universities out there publishing great works of fiction. And that was until I stumbled upon this book called Paranoia by Viktor Martinovich. And this is a work of Belarusian literature. And I'm trying to read one book from every country in the world. I have an incomplete but fairly thorough list down below that you can check out. And this book came onto my radar. I don't even remember how I came across it. I think I probably just Googled like good books from Belarus. And this one came up and I saw it was from Northwestern University Press. So I went to their website and I was absolutely blown away by their insane catalog and the amazing choices they had for literature. I ended up getting 5 or 6 different books from them, of which I've already read 4. But Paranoia is a great book if you're looking for something a little bit different. It's basically like if 1984 was a book about a real place in a real time instead of dystopian and in a fictionalized world. So it's about a guy who gets romantically involved with a woman who's also been romantically involved with a Belarusian politician, and that person has a lot of power, a lot of influence. They're heavily involved in the police state and the surveillance state that exists in modern day Belarus. And obviously that adds a lot of complications to their relationship. And what's kind of fun about this is it's told from a few different perspectives, one of which being the people who are monitoring and spying on this couple. So it's a pretty haunting book, well written. It's funny at times, sad at times, and very experimental at times as well. This next one is probably one of my favorite reads so far this year, and psychologically speaking, it's one of the most dense books I've ever read. It's How to Quiet a Vampire by Borislav Pekic, who is a Serbian author, and this is about a guy who was in the Gestapo, and it takes place about 20 years after the end of the war. He's gone back to the town where he was serving as a Gestapo officer, and he's kind of like reimagining what actually happened during his time as a Nazi, and then he's writing letters to his brother-in-law, kind of justifying his actions and his participation in the Nazi regime. Very dense, very difficult read. Some people have compared this to The Tunnel by William Gass, which stylistically it's very different, but I would say thematically is very close. So if you like philosophical and challenging literature, this is definitely a good choice for you. And it's also part of a series called Writings from an Unbound Europe, which I haven't looked into too much, but there's a series of books in this kind of lineup that are from a bunch of different authors. And I think it's really books focusing on that post-World War II and Holocaust era. But be warned, it is a little bit tough to find a copy of this right now. I do believe Northwestern University Press, at least at the time of recording this, is sold out. So you might have to look for a used copy. Northwestern University Press doesn't exclusively publish works in translation. They do have some American authors and authors writing in English. This year I also read God Went Like That by Ixtamaya Murray. This was an interesting read. I didn't really know what to expect. It kind of just caught my eye as far as the title was concerned. And it's basically a fictionalized retelling of an actual nuclear disaster, I should say, that happened at a power plant in California. And so this is told as a series of interviews. This woman's working as an EPA agent. She's trying to kind of reconstruct what actually happened with the power plant malfunction. So she is going around interviewing the employees of the power plant. Even though the broader theme is about like the dangers of nuclear power, or maybe like the follies of the agencies that are supposed to be ensuring the safety for all of us, it really is a very human book, and it dives into the personal stories of the employees, not so much the politics of it. I thought it struck a good balance, and Murray did a good job of having distinct voices, which can be tough when you have one author just writing like a series of interviews of 15 different people. Murray's written a few other books. I don't really know much about them, but I would definitely be open to reading more from her. And the last book that I've read from Northwestern University Press is The Kukotsky Enigma by Ludmila Ulitskaya, who was considered a fairly decent favorite for the Nobel Prize this year. Obviously, she didn't win. That went to Laszlo Krasnohorkai. But Ulitskaya is a Russian author. We read this for the book club this year. Honestly, I didn't really love it. It had a lot of things going for it, and a lot of it I did enjoy. But there was this one part of the book, part 2, that really kind of threw a wrench in things. If you know, you know. Some people in the club actually still really liked the book, but for me, that made it challenging. But when you think of Russian literature, of course, people think of the classics like Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and Bulgakov. So it was kind of cool to read something more modern from Russian literature, but she's not living in Russia anymore because she's very critical of the Russian government. And the last publisher I'm going to talk about today is kind of like the big boss of university presses. I think when you think of university presses that are publishing literature and fiction, this name probably comes to mind the most. And I think that's because they're also just known as a leader in the humanities, generally speaking, which unfortunately as of late maybe has fallen off a little bit for reasons I'm not going to get into. But also when you look at the quality of work and the names and the titles that they're publishing, you'll understand why. And that is, of course, the University of Chicago Press. So not only do they put out their own books, but they also do fulfillment for a number of other smaller publications, I think universities and non-universities alike. And they might have a couple imprints as well, but I'm not totally sure about that. But the first book I'm going to talk about, I actually haven't read yet, but I want to use it as a demonstration of the type of work that this publication is putting out. So this is The Bridge on the Drina by Ivo Andric, who is a very famous Yugoslavian author, and this is a very famous book. In fact, anytime I mention that I'm reading one book from every country in the world, this book gets mentioned. People say, have you read The Bridge on the Drina yet? And then usually a argument will break out in the comment section about which country now currently gets to claim him, because obviously being from Yugoslavia, that's been fractured into different regions at this point. But it's a very famous work by a very famous author. I don't know why I haven't read this yet. I'll get to it eventually. But yeah, this is from the University of Chicago Press, and they've been doing this a long time. I mean, this was probably published quite a while ago now. Yeah, so this was originally published in 1945. The English translation was done in 1959, and then the university put out this paperback edition in 1977. So the University of Chicago Press has been doing this for a while, which is why it'll suck if they don't continue their commitment to the humanities. But like I said, different discussion for a different day. Two books that I have read from them. We'll start with A Naked Singularity by Sergio de la Pava. So just like Northwestern University Press, Chicago University Press is publishing a lot of works in translation, but not exclusively, because this was originally written in English. So this was originally self-published, and then University of Chicago Press picked it up. I thought this book was good, but probably not great. I think that you could tell that it was self-published because I felt like it was in need of a little bit more editing. But reader satisfaction on this book is very high. I very rarely hear anyone say anything negative about it if they've read it. And people in our book club really liked it as well. It's my podcast co-host Andy's, one of his favorite books. And it's about a lawyer, a public defender in New York City, and he kind of has a, I would say, psychological unraveling due to the pressures of his job. A lot of people compare this to Infinite Jest, although it's quite a bit shorter and I would say easier to read. But if you liked some of the ideas in Infinite Jest and a lot of the humor in Infinite Jest, you'll probably also really like A Naked Singularity. And the last book I'll talk about today is the Inspector Barlock Mysteries by Friedrich Dürrenmatt, who was a author from Switzerland, writing in German, as people from Switzerland often do. And this guy was considered a bit of a pioneer in the detective and mystery genre, which is a genre that I very rarely read from, but I was too captivated by this cover, and I was looking for a book from Switzerland on my project of reading one book from every country. And I was very pleasantly surprised by this. So it's 2 short stories. This particular collection here is The Judge and His Hangman and Suspicion. I think there are other publications in the past that have published these stories in different collections. So you might be able to find these stories plus one or one of these in some other collection. Anyway, you get it. Despite them being detective stories or mysteries, which I think a lot of time just get like brushed off as genre fiction or fast fiction, I would say these had a lot of literary prowess to them. And the second story, Suspicion, had one of the most well-written and emotionally impactful chapters I've ever read in a book. So I'll put links to all of these down below, as well as a list of all of the university presses that I'm aware of that are publishing great fiction and literature. But if there are any that you know of that aren't on the list, please list them in the comments and I will add them to the description. It's so important that we support these publications that are really committed to publishing great literature on merit and not just commercial viability. We are the ones that have to keep literature alive, and you can do your part by reading the books from these awesome publishers. And of course, the best way to support the channel, if you like what we do, is to join our book club on Patreon. Even if you're not reading the book of the month with us, there's a lot going on. There's additional content that I post only in the club, and we have a very active Discord community with a great group of readers that you can connect with, do deep dives on different books, get recommendations, and so much more. Like I said, it's the best way to support the channel. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.